My mother told me I would ruin her perfect wedding photos, so I made sure she got exactly what she wanted: photos without me in them. What happened next destroyed our family forever. But honestly, I have no regrets about the choice I made that day. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Growing up, I always thought my mom, Patricia Winters, was the strongest woman I knew. She divorced my dad when I was 7 years old, citing irreconcilable differences, though I later learned it was because he'd been having an affair with his secretary for 2 years. The divorce was messy, drawn out, and expensive. My dad, Robert Chen, fought tooth and nail over every dollar of alimony and child support, making the process as painful as possible for everyone involved. After the dust settled, it was just my mom and me in our small 2-bedroom apartment in Portland, Oregon. Those early years were actually some of my happiest memories. We had movie nights every Friday, where we'd order pizza and watch whatever romantic comedy she picked from the local Blockbuster. She'd tell me stories about her dreams of becoming a photographer before she got married and had me showing me old portfolios she'd kept hidden in her closet. We'd spend weekends exploring different neighborhoods, taking pictures with her old film camera, pretending we were professional photographers documenting the city. My mom worked as a dental hygienist at a busy practice downtown, often pulling double shifts to make ends meet. I learned to be independent early, making my own breakfast before school, doing homework without supervision, and entertaining myself on the many evenings she worked late. She'd always apologize for not being around more, promising that things would get better once she got that promotion, or once I got older and could help out more. When I turned 12, she started dating again. There was Marcus, a divorced accountant who took us to fancy restaurants but never seemed comfortable around kids. Then came Derek, a construction foreman who was nice enough but disappeared after 3 months when he got a job offer in another state. Each relationship brought hope that maybe we'd finally have the complete family I'd always wanted. But they all ended the same way, with my mom crying on the couch while I brought her tissues and promised her that we didn't need anyone else. Everything changed when I was 14 and she met Bradley Richardson at a medical conference in Seattle. He was a successful orthodontist, 12 years older than her, recently divorced with no children of his own. From the moment she came home from that conference, she was different. She'd spend hours on the phone with him, giggling like a teenager and twirling her hair around her finger. She started wearing makeup to grocery store runs and bought new clothes that she couldn't really afford. Bradley lived in a massive house in the hills overlooking the city, complete with a 3-car garage, swimming pool, and manicured gardens that required professional maintenance. When my mom first brought me to meet him, I was intimidated by the sheer size of his home and the obvious wealth it represented. Bradley seemed nice enough, asking about school and my hobbies, though I could tell he was trying hard to impress my mom rather than genuinely connect with me. The relationship moved fast, faster than any of her previous relationships. Within 6 months, she was spending most weekends at his place, leaving me alone in our apartment with $20 for food and instructions to call if there were any emergencies. She'd return Sunday evenings glowing and happy, full of stories about fancy restaurants, wine tastings, and weekend trips to his cabin in the mountains. By the time I turned 15, she was basically living there full-time, though she kept our apartment for stability, and because she didn't want to rush things, I saw less and less of her, and when I did, the conversations always seemed to circle back to Bradley. What he'd said, where he'd taken her, what he thought about various topics. It was like she was slowly disappearing into this new life she was building with him. The engagement happened on my 16th birthday. I remember because she came home that evening with a huge diamond ring on her finger, practically bouncing with excitement. She'd planned to tell me over dinner, but she couldn't contain herself and blurted it out the moment she walked through the door. I was sitting at our kitchen table doing homework when she burst in, holding her hand out for me to see. "Jessica, look, Bradley proposed?" she squealed, wiggling her fingers so the diamond caught the light. "Can you believe it? We're going to be a real family." I should have been happy for her. She'd been alone for 9 years, working hard and sacrificing so much to raise me on her own. She deserved happiness and security. But something about the way she said real family stung. Weren't we already a real family? Just the two of us? Had all those years together meant nothing? The wedding planning consumed her completely. Every conversation became about venues, flowers, dresses, catering, photographers, and guest lists. She'd spend hours on the phone with wedding planners, florists, and caterers, speaking in an excited, high-pitched voice I barely recognized. Our Friday movie nights disappeared, replaced by her wedding planning sessions where she'd spread magazines and printouts across our coffee table while I retreated to my room. She quit her job at the dental practice, claiming that Bradley made enough money to support both of us and that she needed to focus on planning the wedding of her dreams. This left me alone in the apartment even more, as she spent her days running wedding errands or having lunch with Bradley's friends and their wives, women who, according to her stories, lived in the same affluent circles she was desperate to join. The first real warning sign came during a dress fitting 3 months before the wedding. She'd been talking about finding me the perfect dress for her special day, something that would photograph well and complement her bridal gown without overshadowing it. We went to an expensive boutique in the upscale part of town, a place I'd never set foot in before. The saleswoman, a thin woman with perfectly styled blonde hair, showed us several options while my mom critiqued each one with an intensity I'd never seen before. Too bright, too plain, too formal, too casual. Nothing seemed to meet her vision. Finally, she found a pale blue dress that was simple, elegant, and expensive enough to make me wince when I saw the price tag. But when I tried it on, something shifted in her expression. She stared at me in the fitting room mirror with a look I couldn't quite interpret. It wasn't pride or happiness. It was something closer to concern, maybe even disappointment. "It's beautiful on you," she said slowly. "Maybe too beautiful." I didn't understand what she meant at the time. I thought she was complimenting me, telling me I looked nice in the dress. It wasn't until later that I realized she was already worried about me standing out in her perfect wedding photos, already calculating how my presence might affect the aesthetic she was trying to create. The wedding was planned for June, right after my graduation from high school. She'd chosen the date specifically so it wouldn't interfere with my school schedule, which I initially took as a sign that she still cared about my priorities. The venue was Bradley's Country Club, an exclusive place with rolling green lawns, pristine gardens, and a reputation for hosting only the most elegant events. As the wedding date approached, my mom's behavior became increasingly erratic. She'd have emotional breakdowns over minor details like the wrong shade of roses or a miscommunication with the photographer. She'd spend hours staring at herself in mirrors, pulling at her skin and criticizing her appearance in ways that made me uncomfortable. She started talking about the wedding photos constantly, mentioning how important it was that everything look perfect, because these pictures would last forever. I tried to be supportive, helping with small tasks like addressing invitations and organizing RSVPs, but she seemed to view my efforts as more hindrance than help. She'd redo everything I did, claiming it wasn't up to her standards or that I didn't understand her vision. I began to feel like an outsider in the planning of an event where I was supposed to be an important participant. The breaking point came exactly 2 weeks before the wedding, during what was supposed to be our final dress fitting. I'd lost a few pounds since the original fitting due to stress and my irregular eating schedule. My mom had been too busy with wedding preparations to keep regular groceries in the house. The dress needed minor alterations to fit properly. As I stood on the fitting platform while the seamstress pinned the hem, my mom sat in a chair behind me, staring at my reflection with that same unreadable expression from months earlier. The fee. Seamstress was chatting about how lovely I looked and what a beautiful wedding party it was going to be, but my mom remained silent. Finally, she spoke, and her words would echo in my mind for years to come. "You know, Jessica," she said in a voice so calm it was almost conversational, "I've been thinking about the photos. This is my one chance to have the perfect wedding, the kind I always dreamed about. Every detail needs to be absolutely flawless." Nodded, assuming she was going to ask me to be extra careful with my makeup or hair on the wedding day. "I need you to understand how important this day is to me," she continued. "I've waited so long for this, sacrificed so much. I need everything to be perfect, and I mean everything." Something in her tone made me turn around to look at her directly. Her face was serious, almost businesslike, as if she were delivering a presentation rather than talking to her daughter. "I don't want anything or anyone to ruin my perfect wedding photos." The silence in the boutique stretched uncomfortably as my mom's words hung in the air. The seamstress continued pinning my hem, oblivious to the tension that had suddenly filled the room. I studied my mother's reflection in the three-way mirror, trying to understand what she was really saying. "What do you mean?" I asked, though part of me already knew I didn't want to hear the answer. She stood up from her chair and moved closer, placing her hands on my shoulders in a gesture that might have looked motherly to an outside observer. But her grip was firm, almost possessive, and her eyes never left my reflection in the mirror. "Bradley's family is going to be there," she explained, her voice taking on that rehearsed quality she'd developed when talking about wedding details. "His ex-wife's family, his business partners, people from the country club. These are important people, Jessica. The kind of people who notice everything. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off." The seamstress finished with the hem and stepped back to admire her. "Work? There we are, all done. You look absolutely stunning, dear. Your mother must be so proud." My mom's smile was bright and automatic. "Thank you so much. Could you give us just a moment alone?" Once the seamstress left, closing the fitting room curtain behind her, my mom's expression changed entirely. The practiced smile disappeared, replaced by something harder, more calculating. "I've been looking at the mock-ups from the photographer," she continued as if our conversation hadn't been interrupted. "The way the bridal party will be arranged, the lighting, everything. And there's a problem." I turned around on the platform to face her directly, no longer wanting to have this conversation through mirror reflections. "What kind of problem?" She pulled out her phone and showed me a photo. It was from Bradley's brother's wedding 2 years earlier. The wedding party was arranged in a classic formation, with the bride and groom in the center and the wedding party flanking them on either side. "Look at this," she said, zooming in on the photo. "See how the maid of honor draws attention away from the bride? She's too tall, too prominent. The eye goes to her instead of where it should go." I stared at the photo, confused. The maid of honor looked lovely, but certainly not like she was overshadowing anyone. If anything, the composition looked balanced and natural. "I don't see what you're seeing, Mom," she sighed, the kind of exasperated sigh she used to reserve for when I didn't understand complicated math homework. "Jessica, you're 17 now. You're not a little girl anymore. You've developed. You're going to draw attention, and that's not what I need on my wedding day." The words hit me like a physical blow. I looked down at myself in the pale blue dress, suddenly hyper-aware of how it fit, how I looked, how much space I took up in the world. Was I too tall? Too developed? Too much? "I've been thinking about this for weeks," she continued, scrolling through more photos on her phone. "Looking at all these wedding photos, studying the compositions. In every single one where the bride gets overshadowed, it's because someone in the bridal party is pulling focus." She showed me photo after photo, each one annotated in her mind with criticism of bridesmaids who were too pretty, too tall, too curvy, or anything that might compete with the bride. It was like she'd been conducting a scientific study of wedding photography, cataloging every possible way her special day could be ruined. "So, what are you saying?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand with horrible clarity. "I'm saying that maybe it would be better if you weren't at the wedding party." The words came out in a rush like she'd been practicing them. "You could still be at the ceremony, of course. You could sit in the front row with my sister Karen. But for the photos, for the processional, it might be better if it was just Bradley's niece Stephanie as my maid of honor." Stephanie was Bradley's 19-year-old niece, a petite blonde who worked part-time at a boutique while taking community college classes. She was sweet enough, but we'd only met 3 times, and each interaction had been brief and awkward. The idea of her taking my place in my mother's wedding felt surreal. "You want me to step down as your maid of honor so Stephanie can do it instead?" I asked, needing to hear her say it explicitly. "It's not personal, Jessica. It's about aesthetics, the overall vision." She was using her business voice now, the same tone she'd adopted when talking to wedding vendors. "Stephanie photographs really well. She's got that classic look that will complement my dress perfectly. And she's shorter than you, so the proportions will be better." I stepped down from the fitting platform, suddenly needing to be at her eye level for this conversation. "Mom, I'm your daughter. Doesn't that matter more than how tall I am?" Of course it matters. But her voice lacked conviction, and she couldn't quite meet my eyes. "This isn't about not wanting you there. It's about making sure everything is perfect. You understand how important this is to me, don't you?" I thought about all the conversations we'd had about the wedding, how she'd talked about it being her dream day, her chance to finally have everything she'd always wanted. I thought about the sacrifices she'd made raising me alone, the long hours, at work, the dating disasters. Maybe she did deserve one perfect day. "What would I wear if I'm not at the wedding party?" I asked quietly. Her face brightened instantly, as if my question meant I was agreeing to her plan. "I saw the perfect dress at Nordstrom last week. It's navy blue, very elegant, very appropriate for the mother of the bride's daughter. Not too formal, not too casual. It would be perfect for photos if we need any family shots." The phrase "mother of the bride's daughter" stung more than I expected. Not my daughter, not the bride's daughter, but this awkward, distancing description that made me sound like an accessory rather than family. "Have you talked to Bradley about this?" I asked. She hesitated for just a moment too long. "Bradley wants whatever makes me happy. He knows how important this day is to me." That hesitation told me everything I needed to know. She hadn't discussed this with Bradley at all. This was entirely her decision, her vision, her need for control over every detail of her perfect day. "I need to think about it," I said, starting to change out of the blue dress. "There's not much time to think," she replied, glancing at her. "Watch. We need to let Stephanie know so she can get fitted for a dress. And the photographer needs to know about the change in the bridal party lineup." I paused halfway through hanging up the dress. "You've already talked to Stephanie about this?" The guilty look that flashed across her face was answer enough. She'd already offered Stephanie the maid of honor position before even discussing it with me. This wasn't a conversation or a request. It was a notification of a decision that had already been made. "I mentioned it as a possibility," she said carefully. "I wanted to make sure she was available before bringing it up with you." Available. Like being my mother's maid of honor was a job opening rather than a family honor. We drove home in silence, the garment bag with my never-to-be-worn maid of honor dress hanging in the back seat like a ghost. My mom turned on the radio and hummed along to love songs, seemingly unaware of or unbothered by the devastation sitting in the passenger seat beside her. That evening, she spent 3 hours on the phone with various wedding vendors, updating them about the small change in the bridal party. I could hear her from my room, her voice bright and cheerful, as she explained that her daughter would no longer be participating in the wedding party due to logistical reasons. She never mentioned the real reason, never admitted that she'd demoted her own daughter for the sake of better photographs. I lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, trying to process what had happened. In the span of a single afternoon, I'd gone from being the maid of honor at my mother's wedding to being a guest who needed to be careful not to overshadow the bride. The message was clear. I was too much. Too tall, too developed, too present. I was a threat to her perfect day simply by existing. The next morning, she acted like nothing had happened. She made pancakes, my favorite breakfast, and chatted about the final details for the reception. When I didn't respond to her cheerful commentary about centerpieces and seating arrangements, she finally acknowledged the elephant in the room. "You're not still upset about yesterday, are you?" she asked, flipping a pancake with practiced ease. "I thought you'd understand. You've always been so mature for your age, mature for my age." Another phrase that had followed me throughout childhood, usually deployed when she needed me to handle disappointment or take care of myself while she dealt with adult problems. But this time, it felt different. This time, it felt like manipulation, trying to understand, I said carefully. "But it's hard not to feel like you're ashamed of me." She set down the spatula and turned to face me, her expression genuinely surprised. "Ashamed? Jessica, why would I be ashamed of you? Because you don't want me in your wedding photos. Because you think I'll ruin them just by being there. It's not about ruining anything," she insisted. "It's about creating the best possible photos. It's about artistic composition and visual harmony. It's not personal." But it felt deeply personal. It felt like every insecurity I'd ever had about my appearance, my worth, my place in her life, had been confirmed in a single conversation in a boutique fitting room. The week following the boutique incident was a masterclass in passive-aggressive warfare. My mom continued planning her perfect wedding while pretending nothing had changed between us. But every interaction felt loaded with unspoken tension. She'd ask for my opinion on flower arrangements with the same enthusiasm as before, then dismiss my suggestions with comments like, "Well, you don't really understand the aesthetic I'm going for." I tried to talk to my dad about what was happening, but our relationship had been strained ever since the divorce. He'd remarried 2 years earlier and had a new baby with his second wife, Sandra. When I called him, I could hear the baby crying in the background while he gave me distracted, half-hearted responses. "Your mother knows what she's doing," he said when I explained the situation. "Wedding planning is stressful. Just go along with what makes her happy." Going along with what made her happy had been my default setting for most of my life, but something about this felt different. This wasn't about compromising on a restaurant choice or letting her pick the movie for our Friday night tradition. This was about being erased from one of the most important days of her life because my existence didn't fit her vision of perfection. 3 days before the wedding, my mom's sister Karen called me. Aunt Karen lived in Chicago and was flying in for the ceremony, planning to stay at our apartment since my mom was spending the pre-wedding nights at Bradley's house to maintain the tradition of not seeing each other before the ceremony. "So, I hear you're not at the wedding party anymore?" Karen's voice was carefully neutral, but I could detect the undercurrent of concern. "Mom didn't tell you why?" I asked. There was a pause. "She said something about logistical issues, that it would be better for the photos if Stephanie was the maid of honor instead." "Did she tell you that she thinks I'm too tall and too developed to stand next to her in pictures?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought we might have been disconnected. Finally, Karen sighed heavily. "Oh, Jessica, I'm so sorry." That simple acknowledgement of how wrong the situation was made me start crying for the first time since the boutique conversation. I'd been holding everything in, trying to be mature and understanding, but hearing someone else validate that this was hurtful and inappropriate broke something loose inside me. "I don't know what to do," I admitted through tears. "She acts like I'm being dramatic for being upset about it. Have you tried talking to Bradley? Maybe he doesn't know what's really happening. I hadn't considered that possibility. In all the wedding planning chaos, Bradley had remained somewhat in the background, deferring to my mom's preferences and seeming content to let her orchestrate every detail. But maybe he would have a different perspective if he understood the real reason behind the last-minute change. That afternoon, while my mom was at her final dress fitting, I drove to Bradley's house. I'd only been there a handful of times and never alone, but I felt desperate enough to risk the awkwardness of an unannounced visit. Bradley answered the door in golf clothes, clearly surprised to see me. "Jessica, is everything okay? Where's your mom?" "She's at her dress fitting. I was hoping I could talk to you about something." He invited me in, offering me a drink and settling into the expensive leather armchair that dominated his living room. The house was immaculate, decorated in neutral tones with carefully chosen art pieces that looked like they'd been selected by a professional rather than reflecting personal taste. "What's on your mind?" he asked, and for the first time in months, I felt like an adult was actually listening to me. I explained the situation as objectively as I could, starting with the boutique conversation and ending with my demotion from maid of honor. Bradley's expression grew increasingly troubled as I spoke, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Jessica, I had no idea," he said finally. "Your mom told me you'd decided you'd be more comfortable as a guest rather than in the wedding party. She said you were feeling overwhelmed by the responsibilities." So she'd lied to him completely, creating a narrative where I was the one who'd requested the change. The manipulation was breathtaking in its completeness. "Did she mention anything about the photos? About me not fitting the aesthetic?" He shook his head, looking genuinely disturbed. "Nothing like that. And honestly, the idea that you would somehow ruin wedding photos it's absurd. You're a beautiful young woman, and you're her daughter. Of course you should be at the wedding party." For the first time in days, I felt a spark of hope. If Bradley understood how wrong this was, maybe he could talk to my mom, make her see the reason. "Would you talk to her?" I asked. "Maybe if it comes from you, she'll reconsider." Bradley promised he would, and I left his house feeling lighter than I had since the boutique incident. But that evening, when my mom returned from her dress fitting, I could tell immediately that Bradley had kept his word, and the conversation hadn't gone well. She slammed the door harder than necessary and dropped her purse on the kitchen counter, with more force than required. When she saw me sitting at the table doing homework, her expression darkened further. "So you went to Bradley behind my back," she said without preamble. "You tried to turn my fiancé against me 3 days before our wedding. I didn't try to turn him against you. I just told him what really happened. What really happened is that you're being a selfish teenager who can't handle not being the center of attention for one single day." Her voice was rising, taking on a shrill quality I'd rarely heard before. "This is my wedding, Jessica. Mine, not yours. And if you can't be supportive, maybe you shouldn't be there at all." The threat hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud. Was she really suggesting I shouldn't come to her wedding at all? "What did Bradley say when you talked to him?" I asked, needing to know how much damage the conversation had done. "He said I should reconsider, that it would look strange to people if my own daughter wasn't in the wedding party." She laughed, but it was a bitter sound with no humor in it. "He doesn't understand that some people are just naturally photogenic and others aren't. He doesn't understand visual composition or artistic balance. He thinks I should be your maid of honor." Bradley is a man. Men don't understand these things. She waved her hand dismissively, as if his opinion was irrelevant, despite him being the groom. They don't notice details. They don't see how one person can throw off an entire composition. That night, I heard her on the phone with someone, probably her wedding planner or photographer, making sure that all the arrangements for Stephanie as maid of honor were finalized. Her voice carried through the thin walls of our apartment. excited and animated as she discussed bouquet sizes and positioning for photos. The next morning brought a new development. My mom announced that she'd decided to stay at Bradley's house for the remaining 2 nights before the wedding, leaving me alone in the apartment with Aunt Karen when she arrived. I need to focus on preparing mentally for the biggest day of my life, she explained, packing an overnight bag with more care than I'd ever seen her use. I can't have any negative energy around me right now. Negative energy. That's what I'd become in her mind. Not her daughter who was hurt and confused, but negative energy that threatened her perfect wedding experience. After she left, I sat in the apartment that suddenly felt enormous and empty. All the wedding magazines were gone from the coffee table, taken to Bradley's house where she could continue her preparations without my contaminating presence. The pale blue maid of honor dress hung in my closet like a ghost of what might have been. I called my dad again, this time reaching him when he wasn't distracted by his new family. Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. With me? Okay, he said, and I could hear the wariness in his voice. Do you think I'm too tall? Too developed? Do I draw too much attention? The question seemed to catch him off guard. What? Jessica, why would you ask something like that? I explained the situation again, this time in more detail. Unlike Bradley, my dad had known my mother for years before their divorce. He understood her patterns, her insecurities, her need for control. Your mother has always been particular about appearances, he said carefully. Even when we were married, she'd spend hours getting ready for events, changing outfits multiple times, asking me over and over if she looked right. But do you think she's right? About me ruining her photos? Jessica, listen to me carefully. You are beautiful, intelligent, and kind. Any mother would be proud to have you stand beside her on her wedding day. The fact that she's more concerned about photographs than your feelings says everything about her priorities and nothing about your worth. It was the most direct criticism of my mother I'd ever heard from him, and also the most supportive he'd ever been of me. For a moment, I felt validated and understood, but then reality set in. Regardless of what my dad or Bradley thought, my mom had made her decision. In 2 days, she would walk down the aisle at the country club, surrounded by Bradley's family and friends, with Stephanie as her maid of honor. I would sit in the front row like any other guest, watching my mother marry a man who thought I should be in the wedding party while she got the perfect photos she'd dreamed of. The question that kept me awake that night wasn't whether she was right or wrong. I'd already concluded she was wrong. The question was what I was going to do about it. Was I going to show up and smile through the ceremony, pretending everything was fine while my heart broke? Was I going to sit in that front row and watch my mother get her perfect wedding photos, while knowing that my absence from the wedding party was the price of that perfection? Or was I going to do something else entirely? Aunt Karen arrived the morning before the wedding, taking one look at my face and immediately understanding that the situation was worse than she'd imagined. She'd brought her own dress for the ceremony, a sophisticated burgundy number that she'd bought specifically to complement the wedding colors my mom had chosen months ago. "Where's Patricia?" she asked, setting her suitcase down in the living room. "At Bradley's house. She's been staying there to prepare mentally for her big day," I said, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. Karen raised an eyebrow at my tone, but didn't comment immediately. Instead, she unpacked methodically, hanging up her dress and arranging her toiletries in the bathroom with the efficient movements of someone who traveled frequently for work. It wasn't until we were sitting at the kitchen table sharing a late breakfast that she brought up the wedding situation directly. "Tell me exactly what happened," she said, "and don't leave anything out." So I told her everything. The boutique conversation, the lies to Bradley, the accusation that I was being selfish and creating negative energy. Karen listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker with each detail. When I finished, she was quiet for several minutes, stirring her coffee with mechanical precision. "Your mother called me last week," she finally said. She was gushing about how perfect everything was going to be, how she'd finally have the wedding of her dreams. She mentioned that Stephanie was going to be such a wonderful maid of honor, because she was exactly the right type for the photos. The right type, I repeated flatly. I should have pressed her on what that meant. I should have realized. Karen trailed off, shaking her head. Jessica, what your mother is doing is wrong. Not just hurtful. Wrong. You don't demote your own daughter from your wedding party because of how she looks. It was validating to hear someone else say it so directly, but it didn't change the reality of the situation. What am I supposed to do? The wedding is tomorrow. Karen was quiet again, but I could see her mind working. Have you decided if you're going to attend? The question I'd been avoiding all week. I don't know. Part of me thinks I should go, be the bigger person, show up and smile through it all. And the other part? The other part thinks that if she doesn't want me in her perfect wedding photos, maybe I shouldn't be there at all. We spent the afternoon doing mundane things, grocery shopping, cleaning the apartment, watching old movies. But the wedding loomed over every interaction. Every time my phone buzzed, I expected it to be my mother with some last-minute request or update, but she remained silent. According to her social media posts, which I checked obsessively despite knowing it would only hurt, she was having a magical pre-wedding day with her beautiful girls, meaning Stephanie and Bradley's female relatives. That evening, my phone finally rang. But it wasn't my mother. It was Stephanie. Hi, Jessica, she said, her voice small and uncertain. I hope it's okay that I'm calling you. I was so surprised I nearly dropped the phone. Of course. What's up? I wanted to talk to you. About tomorrow. About the maid of honor thing. She paused, and I could hear voices in the background. Probably the beautiful girls my mother had been posting about. I feel really weird about this whole situation. Weird how? Your mom asked me to be her maid of honor and I was honored, you know? But then Bradley mentioned something today about how it should really be you, and I started thinking about how strange it is that you're not doing it. My heart started beating faster. What exactly did Bradley say? He said that family should come first in weddings, and that he didn't understand why you weren't the maid of honor anymore. When I asked your mom about it, she got really intense. She started talking about photo compositions and aesthetic balance and how some people are just naturally better for certain roles. Even through the phone, I could hear the discomfort in Stephanie's voice. She was 19, barely older than me, and clearly out of her depth in this adult drama. She said those things to you? I asked. Yeah, and honestly, it made me really uncomfortable. Like you're her daughter. Shouldn't that matter more than how tall you are or whatever? The fact that even Stephanie, who barely knew our family and had everything to gain by going along with my mother's plan, could see how wrong this was, spoke volumes. Stephanie, can I ask you something? Sure. Do you actually want to be the maid of honor? The pause that followed was telling. I mean, it's an honor to be asked, but if I'm being totally honest, it feels weird taking your place, and your mom has been a lot. She's had me doing practice walks and practicing poses for photos. She made me try on the dress 3 times today to make sure the fit was perfect. It's kind of intense. I almost laughed at the description. Of course my mother was treating Stephanie like a prop in her perfect wedding production. I'm sorry she's putting pressure on you, I said. This isn't your fault. I know, but I still feel bad about it. Is there anything I can do? It was a genuine offer, and I appreciated it. But what could she do? The wedding was tomorrow. The photographer had been briefed. The arrangements were made. My mother had orchestrated every detail to ensure her perfect day. After we hung up, I sat on my bed staring at the navy blue dress she'd picked out for me, the appropriate outfit for the mother of the bride's daughter. It was hanging on my closet door, a physical reminder of my demotion from family member to wedding guest. Around 10 o'clock, my phone rang again. This time it was my mother. "Jessica, I need you to be at the country club by 8 tomorrow morning," she said without preamble. "The photographer wants to get some shots of the family before the chaos starts." "What kind of shots?" "Just some casual photos of me getting ready, maybe a few with you and Karen. Nothing formal." Her voice was brisk, businesslike. "Wear something simple and neutral. Nothing that will distract from the main subject." The main subject. Not the bride, not her. The main subject. Like she was directing a photo shoot rather than planning her daughter's involvement in her wedding day. "Mom, can we talk about—" "I can't talk right now, Jessica. I'm having a girls' night with my wedding party, and I need to focus on positive energy tonight. Just be there at 8, okay?" She hung up before I could respond, leaving me staring at my phone in the dark apartment. Through the thin walls, I could hear Aunt Karen moving around in the living room, probably preparing her own outfit for tomorrow. I walked out to find her ironing her burgundy dress with meticulous care. "That was my mom," I said. "She wants me. There at 8 for some family photos before the wedding." Karen looked up from the ironing board. "Family photos that you're not actually family enough to be in the wedding party for? Apparently, I'm family enough for casual getting-ready shots, just not family enough to stand next to her during the ceremony." Karen set down the iron with more force than necessary. The hypocrisy is breathtaking. We stood there in silence for a moment, both staring at the dress she was preparing to wear to a wedding that felt more like a performance than a family celebration. "Jessica," Karen said quietly, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to really hear me." I nodded, settling onto the couch. "Your mother has always struggled with feeling like she wasn't good enough. When she married your father, she constantly worried that she wasn't pretty enough, smart enough, successful enough. When they divorced, those insecurities got worse. She became obsessed with projecting an image of having everything together. This wasn't news to me. I'd watched my mother's insecurities play out my entire life. But Karen wasn't finished. What's happening with this wedding isn't really about you, Jessica. It's about her need to prove to everyone, including herself, that she's finally achieved the perfect life she always wanted. You've become a threat to that narrative, not because of anything you've done, but because you represent the messier parts of her history. So, I'm supposed to just accept being erased from her perfect day? No, Karen said firmly. I'm saying that you need to understand that this is about her brokenness, not your worth, and you need to decide how much of yourself you're willing to sacrifice to enable her dysfunction. That phrase echoed in my mind long after we'd both gone to bed. How much of yourself are you willing to sacrifice to enable her dysfunction? I lay awake until 3 a.m, staring at the ceiling and thinking about family photos where I'd be positioned carefully to complement the main subject, about sitting in a front row watching my mother's perfect wedding while knowing I'd been deemed too imperfect to participate, about years of making myself smaller to accommodate her insecurities. When my alarm went off at 6:30, I knew what I was going to do. I got up, showered, and put on jeans and a t-shirt instead of the careful, neutral outfit she'd requested. I wrote 2 notes, one for Aunt Karen, explaining my decision and asking her to attend the wedding without me, and one for my mother. The note to my mother was simple. You said you didn't want me to ruin your perfect wedding photos. I'm making sure that doesn't happen. Enjoy your perfect day, Jessica. I left both notes on the kitchen table, grabbed my car keys, and walked out of the apartment. It was 7:15 on the morning of my mother's wedding, and I was finally done sacrificing pieces of myself to maintain her illusion of perfection. Drove aimlessly for an hour, my phone buzzing incessantly in the passenger seat. I didn't need to look to know who was calling. The wedding was supposed to start at 11, which meant my mother would have arrived at the country club around 8 to find me nowhere to be found. By now, she would have discovered my note. Eventually, I pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town and finally checked my phone. 14 missed calls from my mother, 6 from Aunt Karen, 3 from Bradley, and 2 from numbers I didn't recognize. Probably wedding party members or family friends enlisted to track me down. The voicemails started angry and became increasingly frantic. Jessica, where the hell are you? Get to the country club right now. This is not the time for teenage dramatics. I need you here. You are being selfish and cruel. How could you do this to me on my wedding day? Please, Jessica, just come back. We can talk about this after the ceremony. The final voicemail was from Aunt Karen, her voice steady but concerned. Honey, I understand why you left. Call me when you're ready. I'm here for you, whatever you decide. I ordered coffee and sat in a corner booth, watching the normal Saturday morning activities of people who weren't dealing with family implosions. A couple shared pancakes while reading the newspaper. A construction worker grabbed coffee before his shift. A mother fed her toddler while balancing a baby on her lap. Regular people living regular lives, unburdened by the weight of someone else's desperate need for perfection. Around 10:30, Bradley called again. This time, I answered. Jessica, thank God. Where are you? Your mother is beside herself. I'm safe, I said simply. I just can't be there today. Look, I know there's been some tension about the wedding party situation, but can't we work this out after the ceremony? Your mom really needs you there. It was telling that even now, he was still describing it as tension rather than what it really was. A fundamental rejection of my worth as a daughter. Bradley, did she tell you what she said to me? The real reason she didn't want me as maid of honor? There was a pause. She said it was about the photos, about wanting everything to look perfect. She told me I would ruin her perfect wedding photos because I'm too tall and too developed. She said some people are just naturally photogenic and others aren't, implying that I'm one of the others. The silence stretched long enough that I thought he might have hung up. She said that to you? His voice was quieter now, lacking the urgent pleading tone from before. She did. And then she lied to you about why I wasn't going to be at the wedding party anymore. She told you I requested the change because I felt overwhelmed. Another long pause. Jessica, I'm so sorry. I had no idea she'd said those things to you. I tried to tell you when I came to your house, but she managed to spin it differently. I should have pressed harder, should have realized. He trailed, off, and I could hear wedding chaos in the background, voices calling his name, someone asking about flowers, the general mayhem of a wedding morning now complicated by a missing family member. Bradley, I need you to understand something. This isn't about the wedding or about you. This is about the fact that my mother told me I would ruin her perfect day just by being in the photos. How am I supposed to come sit in the front row and smile through a ceremony where I've been told my presence is a liability? You're right, he said, and the simple acknowledgement meant more than all the frantic voicemails demanding my return. You're absolutely right, and I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. We talked for a few more minutes, with Bradley promising to handle the situation with my mother and suggesting that maybe we could all sit down and talk after they returned from their honeymoon. I appreciated his intentions, but part of me doubted that a conversation would fix what had been broken between my mother and me. After we hung up, I drove to the local park and found a quiet spot by the lake. It was a beautiful June day. Perfect. Wedding weather, as my mother would have noted. I tried to imagine what was happening at the country club. Were they proceeding with the ceremony despite my absence? Was my mother walking down the aisle as planned, or had my departure derailed her perfect timeline? Around noon, my phone rang again. This time it was Aunt Karen. The ceremony is over, she said without preamble. Your mother walked down the aisle. They said their vows, and now they're taking photos. How is she? Karen sighed. Publicly, she's maintaining the facade that everything is wonderful. She told people you had a sudden illness and couldn't attend. But privately? She's falling apart. I felt a complicated mix of emotions: guilt, vindication, sadness, and relief all tangled together. Is she angry? Beyond angry, but also scared. I think. For the first time, someone called her bluff. You didn't just go along with her demands to keep the peace. Did Bradley say anything to her? He tried to talk to her before the ceremony, but she shut him down completely. Said that today was about their love, and she wasn't going to let family drama overshadow it. But I could see it in her eyes during the ceremony. She kept looking at the front row where you should have been sitting. We talked for another 20 minutes, with Karen filling me in on the awkward family dynamics at the reception. Relatives were asking where I was, and my mother's story about sudden illness wasn't holding up under scrutiny, especially since I'd been fine the day before when some of them had seen me. What should I do now? I asked. Whatever you need to do, Karen said firmly. You've spent 17 years managing your mother's emotions and making yourself smaller to accommodate her needs. Maybe it's time to focus on what you need for a change. That afternoon, I drove to my dad's house. Sandra answered the door with the baby on her hip, looking surprised to see me. Jessica, shouldn't you be at your mom's wedding? It's a long story, I said. Is my dad home? When I explained what had happened, my dad's reaction surprised me. Instead of the diplomatic non-response I'd expected, he was genuinely angry on my behalf. She said you would ruin the photos? His voice was tight with barely contained fury. Jesus, Jessica, I knew your mother had issues with appearances, but this is beyond anything I imagined. Sandra, who'd been quietly listening while feeding. The baby looked appalled. That's horrible. You're her daughter. You should have been her maid of honor automatically. It was strange to receive more support from my father's new wife than I'd gotten from my own mother, but also oddly comforting. They invited me to stay for dinner, and for a few hours I experienced what a normal family dynamic looked like. People talking to each other with respect, conflicts addressed directly instead of through manipulation, love expressed without conditions or requirements for perfection. Around 7 o'clock, my phone started buzzing again. The wedding reception would be in full swing now, which meant my mother had probably had enough champagne to fuel another round of angry calls and messages. This time, I turned the phone off entirely. I spent the night at my dad's house, sleeping, in their guest room for the first time since he'd remarried. It felt strange but peaceful to be in a house where I wasn't walking on eggshells, where I wasn't monitoring someone else's mood to determine how I should behave. The next morning, Sandra made pancakes for everyone, a gesture that reminded me of countless breakfasts with my mother, except without the underlying tension that had characterized so many of our interactions. As I watched my dad play with his new baby, I realized something that had been true for years, but which I'd never allowed myself to acknowledge. My mother's love had always come with conditions, requirements, and expectations that I perform according to her vision of what I should be. My phone, when I finally turned it back on around noon, showed 37 new messages and missed calls from various family members. Most were from my mother, alternating between fury and attempts at emotional manipulation. The most recent ones, sent around midnight, were the most revealing. You've ruined the most important day of my life. I can't believe my own daughter would be so vindictive and selfish. After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me? You've humiliated me in front of Bradley's entire family. I don't know if I can forgive you for this. Reading through the messages, I was struck by how every single one was about her feelings, her embarrassment, her day, her forgiveness. Not once did she acknowledge why I'd left or take any responsibility for the situation that had driven me away. The message that surprised me came from Stephanie. Hey Jessica, I just wanted you to know that I understand why you weren't there yesterday. Your mom spent the whole reception complaining about you to anyone who would listen, and it was really uncomfortable. I hope you're okay. Even the person who had benefited from my absence could see how wrong the situation was. That afternoon, As I prepared to return to the apartment to face whatever came next, I realized that something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in my life, I'd refused to sacrifice my dignity to maintain someone else's illusion of perfection. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure, but it felt like the first authentic choice I'd made in years. When I returned to the apartment Sunday afternoon, I found Aunt Karen packing her suitcase with methodical precision. She looked up when I entered, relief flooding her face. "Thank God you're safe. I've been worried sick." "How bad was it after I left?" Karen closed her suitcase and sat on the edge of the couch. "Honestly, it was a disaster that everyone pretended wasn't happening. Your mother put on this performance of being the radiant bride, but anyone paying attention could see she was barely holding it together." She described the reception in detail, how my mother had cornered various relatives to complain about my betrayal, how she'd drunk too much champagne and become increasingly erratic as the evening progressed, and how Bradley had spent most of the night doing damage control with his family and friends. "The worst part was when she gave her speech," Karen continued. "She thanked everyone for being there on the most perfect day of her life, but then she couldn't help herself. She made this passive-aggressive comment about how some people choose to create drama instead of supporting family, and everyone knew she was talking about you." I winced, imagining the awkwardness of that moment for the wedding guests who had no context for the family drama playing out. "How did Bradley handle it?" "Better than I expected, actually. When she started ranting about you to his business partner's wife, he stepped in and redirected the conversation. Later, I saw him apologizing to people for the family stress that had been affecting the wedding planning." Around 4 o'clock, we heard footsteps in the hallway, followed by the sound of keys in the door. My mother was back from her wedding night, and from the sound of her movements, she wasn't alone. "Jessica Marie Chen, you get out here right now." Her voice carried through the apartment with a fury I'd rarely heard before. I walked into the living room to find my mother still in her reception outfit, a champagne-colored cocktail dress she'd changed into after the ceremony, standing next to Bradley, who looked exhausted and uncomfortable. Her makeup was smudged, her hair disheveled, and her eyes were red-rimmed from what I assumed was a combination of anger and alcohol. "How dare you!" she launched into her tirade before I could even fully enter the room. "How dare you ruin my wedding day? Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I made sure I didn't ruin your perfect photos," I said quietly. "Isn't that what you wanted?" The comment seemed to enrage her further. "Don't you dare turn this around on me. You embarrassed me in front of everyone!" "Bradley's family thinks there's something wrong with us. With our family." "There is something wrong with our family," I replied. "A mother who tells her daughter she'll ruin wedding photos just by existing tends to create problems." Bradley stepped forward, placing a restraining hand on my mother's arm. "Patricia, maybe we should all sit down and talk about this calmly." "Calmly?" She whirled on him. "There's nothing calm about this. She deliberately sabotaged my wedding out of spite. She didn't sabotage anything," Karen interjected from across the room. She removed herself from a situation where she was being treated poorly. "There's a difference." My mother's attention snapped to her sister. "Stay out of this, Karen. You don't understand what I've been dealing with." "I understand perfectly. I understand that you demoted your own daughter from your wedding party because you were worried she might look too good in photos. I understand that you lied to your fiancé about why she wasn't going to be maid of honor anymore. And I understand that instead of apologizing for hurting your child, you're standing here blaming her for having the dignity to walk away." The room fell silent except for my mother's heavy breathing. I could see her processing Karen's words, and for a moment I thought she might actually acknowledge what she'd done wrong. But then her face hardened again. "You want to know the truth?" she said, her voice taking on a dangerous edge. "Fine. The truth is that Jessica has always been jealous of me. Even as a little girl, she couldn't stand when I got attention from men. She'd act out, throw tantrums, do whatever she could to make herself the center of attention. The accusation was so far from reality that it left me momentarily speechless. I'd been a quiet, well-behaved child who'd gone out of my way to avoid causing problems during her dating years. "That's not true," I said. "Isn't it? Every time I tried to build a relationship with someone, you'd find a way to complicate things. You'd get sick when I had dates, or you'd act clingy and needy whenever a man was around." Bradley looked increasingly uncomfortable as my mother continued her revisionist history of my childhood. "And now, when I finally find happiness, when I finally get to have my special day, you can't handle not being the focus of attention, so you sabotage it." "I sabotaged it by not being there?" I asked incredulously. "You sabotaged it by making your absence the story. Everyone was talking about where you were instead of celebrating my marriage." The twisted logic was breathtaking. I'd been told I would ruin her photos by being there, but my absence had somehow ruined her day even more. "Patricia," Bradley said, quietly, "maybe Jessica had a point about the photos. Maybe family should have come before aesthetics." She turned on him with the same fury she'd been directing at me. "Don't you start taking her side. You don't understand what I've dealt with all these years." "I'm not taking sides," he said, his voice steady but tired. "I'm trying to understand how we got to a point where your daughter felt like she couldn't come to your wedding. She could have come. She chose not to. After you told her she would ruin the photos," Karen added. "I never said she would ruin anything. I said I wanted the photos to be perfect by having her not be in them," I said. We were going in circles, with my mother refusing to acknowledge the logical connection between her words and my actions. It was becoming clear that she genuinely couldn't see how telling me I didn't fit. Her aesthetic vision was tantamount to saying I would ruin her perfect day. The argument continued for another 30 minutes, with my mother alternating between fury and attempts at guilt-tripping. She brought up all the sacrifices she'd made raising me alone, the opportunities she'd given up, the hardships she'd endured. It was a greatest hits collection of maternal martyrdom, designed to make me feel guilty for not sacrificing my dignity to her vision of perfection. Finally, Bradley had heard enough. "Patricia, stop," he said firmly. "Just stop." She turned to him with surprise. Apparently, he'd never used that tone with her before. "I've been listening to this for 2 days now," he continued. "On what should have been our honeymoon, I've been listening to you rant about Jessica instead of celebrating our marriage. And frankly, the more I hear, the more I understand why she left." The betrayal on my mother's face was almost comical. Her new husband, the person who was supposed to be unconditionally on her side, was refusing to validate her victimhood narrative. "You don't mean that," she said, her voice suddenly small and uncertain. "I do mean it. What you said to Jessica about the photos was hurtful and inappropriate. A 17-year-old girl shouldn't have to worry about whether she's too pretty to stand next to her mother on her wedding day." "Too pretty?" My mother's voice rose again. "Is that what she told you? That I said she was too pretty?" "You said she was too developed and would draw attention away from you," I clarified. "You said some people are naturally photogenic and others aren't. That's not the same thing." But it was exactly the same thing, and everyone in the room knew it, including her. Bradley shook his head sadly. "Patricia, I married you because I fell in love with the woman who raised her daughter alone and worked so hard to build a good life. But this person, the one who's been raging for 2 days about wedding photos instead of trying to repair her relationship with her child, I don't recognize her." The room fell silent again. For the first time since she'd returned from the wedding, my mother seemed to truly hear what people were saying to her. But instead of reflecting on their words, she did what she'd always done when confronted with uncomfortable truths. She deflected and blamed. "Fine," she said, grabbing her purse from the coffee table. "If everyone wants to gang up on me and make me the villain, then I guess I know where I stand. Jessica, if you want to live here alone and pretend like you don't need family, go ahead. But don't come crawling back to me when you realize what you've thrown away." She stormed toward the door, but Bradley didn't follow her immediately. Jessica, he said quietly, I'm sorry about all of this. You deserved better. Then he left to follow his wife, leaving me and Aunt Karen alone in the apartment that suddenly felt very quiet and very empty. Well, Karen said after a long moment, I don't think that could have gone any worse. But as I looked around the apartment, free from wedding magazines, free from the constant anxiety about someone else's mood, free from the exhausting work of managing my mother's emotions, I wasn't sure I agreed. Sometimes things had to fall apart completely before they could be rebuilt into something healthier. The weeks that followed my mother's dramatic exit were surprisingly peaceful. Aunt Karen extended her stay for another week, helping me navigate the practical aspects of living independently while processing the emotional aftermath of the wedding disaster. She showed me how to budget for groceries, helped me understand lease agreements, and taught me the kind of life skills my mother had never bothered to share. Your mom always treated you more like a confidant than a daughter, Karen observed one evening as we prepared dinner together. She never let you be a kid. And then she got angry when you developed into your own person instead of remaining her emotional support system. During those quiet days, I began to understand patterns in my childhood that I'd never recognized before. The way my mother had shared inappropriate details about her relationships with me, how she'd relied on me to manage her emotions during difficult times, the subtle ways she'd made me responsible for her happiness and stability. I'd been parentified without even realizing it, trained to prioritize her needs over my own development. 2 weeks after the wedding, Bradley called me. I wanted you to know that Patricia and I are getting marriage counseling, he said without preamble. What happened at the wedding made me realize there are some fundamental issues we need to address. How is she handling that? Not well, initially. She kept insisting that the problems were everyone else's fault. Yours, mine, Karen's. But our counselor is good at cutting through that kind of deflection. He went on to explain that my mother had been diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder traits, though she wasn't ready to fully accept that diagnosis yet. The counselor had helped Bradley understand that my mother's behavior toward me wasn't just wedding stress. It was part of a long-standing pattern of emotional manipulation and conditional love. I owe you an apology, Jessica. I should have seen what was happening sooner. I should have stood up for you before it got to that point. You didn't know, I said. She's very good at controlling narratives. That's exactly what the counselor said. She said your mother has probably been managing everyone's perceptions for so long that she might not even realize she's doing it anymore. A month after the wedding, I received an unexpected visitor. My mother showed up at the apartment. On a Thursday evening, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. She wasn't wearing makeup, her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she was dressed in jeans and a plain sweater instead of her usual carefully coordinated outfits. Can we talk? She asked quietly. I let her in, and we sat at the kitchen table where we'd shared thousands of meals over the years. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The counselor says I have control issues, she finally said, staring at her hands. She says I've been using you as an emotional crutch instead of treating you like my daughter. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was the closest thing to self-awareness I'd ever heard from her. She also says that the wedding photo thing was about my own insecurities, not about you actually ruining anything. Her voice was barely above a whisper. She says I was projecting my fears about not being good enough onto you. What do you think about that? I asked carefully. I think... She paused, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easily. I think maybe she's right. I think maybe I've been so afraid of being abandoned again that I tried to control everything. And everyone around me. We talked for 2 hours that evening, the most honest conversation we'd ever had. My mother told me about her childhood with emotionally distant parents who'd valued appearance over authenticity. She described the shame she'd felt during her divorce from my father, the way she'd internalized his criticism and rejection, She admitted that she'd seen my growing independence as a threat, rather than a natural part of my development. "I know I can't undo what happened at the wedding," she said as she prepared to leave. "And I know you probably can't forgive me right away, but I want you to know that I'm trying to understand where I went wrong." It wasn't the dramatic reconciliation scene from a movie, but it was a beginning. Over the following months, my mother and I rebuilt our relationship slowly and carefully. She continued therapy, both individually and with Bradley, working to understand the patterns that had damaged her relationships. I started my own counseling to process years of emotional parentification and to develop healthier boundaries. My mother's progress wasn't linear. There were setbacks, moments when she fell back into old patterns of manipulation or blame shifting. But gradually, she began to take genuine responsibility for her actions and their impact on others. The turning point came 6 months after the wedding, when she asked if I wanted to see the wedding photos. "I need to show you something," she said, during one of our weekly coffee meetings. She pulled out her phone and showed me the professional wedding photos from the reception. In every single shot of the wedding party, there was an obvious gap where I should have been standing. The compositions looked awkward and unbalanced, with too much empty space on one side. Stephanie, sweet as she was, looked uncomfortable and out of place among Bradley's relatives. "They're not perfect," my mother said quietly. "They're missing the most important person." She scrolled to a photo of herself during the ceremony, and for the first time, I could see what Karen had described. The way my mother's eyes kept drifting to the empty spot in the front row where I should have been sitting. "I got the perfect photos I thought I wanted," she continued, "but they just remind me of what I lost by prioritizing the wrong things." A year after the wedding, my mother did something unprecedented. She threw me a belated 18th birthday party and asked me to choose everything: the guest list, the venue, the decorations, the food. It was her way of saying that my preferences mattered, that my happiness was worth celebrating. The party was small, just family and a few close friends, but it felt more meaningful than any elaborate event could have. For the first time in my memory, my mother focused entirely on making me happy rather than managing how things looked to other people. During the party, she pulled me aside and handed me a wrapped gift. "I wanted to give you something special," she said. Inside the box was a beautiful vintage camera, not unlike the one she'd shown me from her old photography dreams. But attached to it was a note that read, "For capturing moments that matter, not moments that look perfect. Love, Mom." As I write this, 3 years after the wedding that changed everything, I'm a junior in college studying photography, inspired partly by my mother's old dreams and partly by my own desire to capture authentic moments rather than manufactured perfection. My mother and I have a relationship built on honesty rather than performance, boundaries rather than enmeshment. She and Bradley are still married, their relationship stronger for having confronted the underlying issues that my wedding absence had exposed. They've learned to communicate directly rather than through manipulation and assumption. My mother still struggles sometimes with her need for control and her fear of abandonment, but now she recognizes these patterns and works to address them, rather than expecting everyone around her to accommodate them. The wedding photos hang in their house now, but not prominently. Instead, the main wall displays candid family photos from holidays and casual gatherings, pictures that capture real moments of connection rather than staged perfection. People often ask if I regret missing my mother's wedding, if I wish I'd just gone along with her demands to keep the peace. The answer is always no. Walking away from that wedding was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but it was also the most important. It forced both of us to confront the unhealthy dynamics we'd been perpetuating for years. My mother wanted perfect wedding photos, and I made sure she got exactly what she asked for. Photos that didn't include anyone who might threaten her vision of perfection. The irony is that those perfect photos became the catalyst for building an imperfect but genuine relationship based on mutual respect rather than conditional love. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's dysfunction, even when that someone is your mother. Sometimes walking away is the only way to create space for something healthier to grow in its place. And sometimes, the pictures that matter most are the ones that capture who we really are, not who we think we should be. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.